What's up everybody, I hope you're well. You guys seem to enjoy my last video on MIDI programming tips, and yeah, let's do some more. So let's jump straight in with the first one. First tip of the day is going to be using different legato speeds within the same musical phrase. Some sample libraries come with different legato speeds, and while that is great because obviously you have more options available, it can be confusing sometimes. Maybe you're not really sure what to use, and I'm gonna give you guys a couple of practical ways to pick the right legato speed. But first of all, we kind of need to understand how all this works. So let's say you're making your own library, you already have all your samples and you want to make a legato patch. In order to do that, most developers would not only record each single note one at a time, but they would also record the actual transition between these notes. And this transition is going to be triggered each time there is an overlap between two notes inside the musical phrase. In theory, the longer the transition it is, the more realistic the phrase is going to sound, but that's going to create a few problems as well. The first very obvious problem is that, if it's a very long chunk of music, that you have to insert between two samples, obviously there's going to be a pretty good delay, and that's very noticeable with some sample libraries like CSS, basically making it very, very hard to perform your lines on the keyboard. The second problem is that, if you have some faster moving kind of lines, there isn't enough space between one note to the next for that transition to be able to trigger correctly. So the phrase is going to sound all weird. And the solution most of the time is going to be making that little chunk of music shorter and shorter in order to be able to fix that and play different kinds of lines without any problems. So let's jump in at the DAW and record something so that I can show you guys which length to pick. So I'm using CSS over here. Let's grab a cello patch. I'm going to be using the classic legato just to perform the line because it has a faster kind of, transition. But then I'm gonna be tweaking the phrase on the, regular legato patch. Okay, very good. So this phrase has a little bit of everything. It has some faster moving lines, some medium lines, and some slow ones. So the very first thing I would probably do is just quantize everything so that it's going to be easier to demonstrate. Make sure that each single note overlaps, and yeah, just fix these kinds of stuff. And then once I'm done, just be dragging it to, that other patch, classic, regular legato. Now, in order to be able to trigger different kind of transitions, you would basically use different velocities. And to make it simpler on us, I just made the velocities even just so that it's going to be easier for us to work on this. With CSS, we have 3 different legato speeds, with medium velocity, we have a medium kind of transition, slow transition with low velocity, and fast transition with high velocity. Very intuitive. And as we said, the longer that little chunk of music it is, the longer the space we need between 2 different notes. So what I would do is find moments in the music where we have some slower moving kind of lines with, maybe quarter notes and half notes and stuff like that, and make those the slowest kind of transitions, like so. The faster moving lines are going to be the fastest transition, and anything else is going to basically stay in the middle. This is going to sound all weird right now because obviously we kind of need to compensate by adding a negative delay. For a faster kind of legato with CSS is roughly 100 milliseconds, so I would just go ahead and nudge them by about the same amount. Medium legato speeds are about 200 milliseconds, and I would just basically nudge them 20 times because I have a set value of 10 milliseconds, each time I nudge a single note. So I'm gonna do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. we're left with the slower kind of transitions, which is around 300 milliseconds. So nudge them 30 times. Cool. So let's have a listen. Okay, we're missing an overlap over here. And if you want to bring it to the next level, you can add little things like, for example, portamento over here, because we have a bigger kind of interval, we have an octave, and just doing a little portamento over there would give the illusion of playing this musical phrase on the same string. And maybe over here on the second bar of the phrase, just not triggering a legato at all, just to suggest, you know, maybe a bow change, make the phrase a little bit more realistic. So let's have a quick listen. This is much, much better than what we originally started with. Second tip of the day is going to be using dynamics to blend different instruments and common doublings. You know, this is a really important kind of concept. Any real orchestra or ensemble of musicians, really doesn't have to be an orchestra, would always, when they're playing together, would always try to blend with each other. You don't really want to have an instrument sticking out from the rest, unless it's a solo part or something like that. But in general, if you think of a real ensemble of musicians, they would blend and they would sound like one. And you can do that with sample libraries too, but it's a little bit trickier because obviously we have instruments being recorded one at a time. Yes. So let's try to demonstrate this with a common kind of doubling, maybe cellos and bassoons. So I'm gonna just copy and paste. And now if I play it, in theory it should work. Let's fix that very quickly. The problem I have with this is that they sound like two separate instruments. So I would probably just kind of play with dynamics a little bit until they blend together. It is kind of difficult to demonstrate with only two instruments. So let's try to record a couple more instruments, maybe like a French horn or something like that. And as I was playing this, I was intentionally kind of holding back a little bit and try to blend, you know, with the other two instruments. So one last thing we could try is adding maybe a bass clarinet or something. So you can see how quite clearly just copying and pasting is not going to work if you want to achieve that kind of effect, and we would have to play with curves a little bit in order to be able to just, you know, fit these different sounds together. You can see how the clarinet is adding a little bit of buzziness to the sound. That may be something that is not super desirable and kind of gets in the way a little bit. And you can cut some of the natural harmonics if they get in the way, maybe with an EQ or something like this. And just using volume as well. And obviously we still have a lot more of the cellos, but that's just the nature of it, you know, because these are very different instruments, you know, they're designed in a different way. But if I were to mute the cellos, in theory, these instruments would still work together. And you can clearly hear how the blend here with just the woodwinds and the brass is working in a much more natural kind of way. But that's just the nature of it. That's orchestration, really. Always keeping blends in mind as you're making the mock-up, because, you know, that's going to, you know, make a huge impact in the end. We only really have a few instruments here, but once you're going to be recording the full piece, you know, a full orchestral piece is going to make a huge difference if you keep that in mind at all times. The next thing I want to talk about is using pre-recorded loops and phrases to essentially add realism to the mockup. I tend to see mockups as, you know, like making a puzzle or something. You know how sometimes when you're trying to make a puzzle, you have some pieces that are already kind of glued together. So yeah, that's basically what it is, you know, using pre-recorded chunks of music other than making music one single note at a time. And just to very quickly demonstrate how this works in context, let's say you have a string and woodwind run, but you don't have a sample library with pre-recorded runs for strings. You can still layer the pre-recorded woodwind run with the strings, and it's going to sound great because it's partially real. So it kind of makes the string sound a little bit more real because the woodwinds are real. Let me try to demonstrate this with something else. Okay, really simple. So we have some kind of measured trills. Let's try to record something else entirely on the bottom, maybe like some French horns or something entirely different. If we mute the click, you'll see how just something as simple as having that string, you know, that pre-recorded kind of phrase on the string is going to add realism to the part because it's a real part. Yep. And the last thing I want to talk about today is going to be a more general kind of rule, making each single instrument sound good. I know it is a pain and it takes forever, and it's something that I had to learn the hard way myself by, you know, delivering stems to, you know, publishers. When you have to do that, each single stem has to sound good, not just in context of the piece. And the very first thing I started to notice was how by making each single instrument, each single phrase, you know, sound good, the overall kind of mock-up sounded way better than it used to. It may be very obvious, but it's a fact, you know, and there's simply no way around it. Obviously, it depends on how much time you have available as well. If you have time to spend on your mock-up and work on your mock-up, you know, the better it's going to sound. Yes. All right, guys, that's it for today. I hope you found these tips useful, and let me know in the comments if you want me to keep making this sort of content and if you want me to talk about more specific kinds of stuff. As always, thank you very much for watching. Like the video if you did, dislike it if you didn't, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.